What happens to knowledge when the world is not ready to hear it? Imagine a library at dusk. Stone walls cooling after centuries of sun. Shelves lined with voices. Mathematicians, healers, astronomers, poets, each convinced that understanding, once written down, could outlast empires. For most of human history, we have believed that knowledge moves in a straight line, discovered, recorded, refined, and passed forward like a torch. But history, when examined closely, tells a quieter and more unsettling story. Knowledge does not only advance, sometimes it vanishes. This story begins not with flames or villains, but with absence, with gaps in the record, with questions scholars still whisper in archives and universities. Why do certain breakthroughs appear suddenly, centuries ahead of their time, only to disappear again? Why do later civilizations struggle to rediscover ideas that earlier cultures seem to grasp with ease? And who decides which truths are preserved and which are allowed to fade? Across continents and centuries, libraries have stood as symbols of collective memory. Alexandria, Constantinople, monasteries in the mountains, temples carved into stone. These were not merely storehouses of books, but living systems of thought, places where science, philosophy, medicine, and myth coexisted without modern boundaries. To lose a library was not just to lose paper and ink, it was to lose momentum. To interrupt a conversation humanity was having with itself. We are often told simple endings to these stories: fires, wars, accidents. The reassuring idea that knowledge was lost through chaos, not choice, but history is rarely that innocent. In the shadows of these explanations lies a more complex reality, that knowledge can be inconvenient, dangerous, destabilizing, and that power, political, religious, economic, has always had a complicated relationship with truth. This documentary is not an accusation nor a promise of forbidden revelations. It is an exploration of tension between curiosity and control, between discovery and authority, between what humans have known and what they were allowed to remember. The episodes that follow revisit moments when knowledge changed hands quietly, when texts were removed, redirected, reinterpreted, or sealed away, sometimes for protection, sometimes for fear, often for reasons history only hints at. We will move carefully. Many of these stories survive only as fragments, disputed accounts, or later interpretations layered over centuries of retelling. Certainty is rare here. What matters instead is pattern. Again and again we see institutions, empires, churches, states, corporations, grappling with ideas that threaten their sense of order. New ways of understanding the cosmos, the body, time, human potential itself. Consider how unsettling it can be to realize that progress is not guaranteed, that entire branches of understanding can be pruned away, not because they are false, but because they arrive too early, or because they challenge the structures that benefit from ignorance. In those moments, suppression does not always look like destruction. More often, it looks like classification, reframing, silence. This is a story about limits, not of intelligence but of courage, about how societies choose stability over truth, control over curiosity, and about the cost of those choices, measured not only in lost inventions or delayed sciences, but in the narrowing of imagination itself. As we begin, hold one question in mind, not whether ancient people knew more than we do or whether secrets were hidden away in vaults, but something simpler and more human. If knowledge is power, who has carried it through history, and who has been asked to forget? The silence of lost libraries still echoes. And sometimes listening to that silence tells us more than any surviving text ever could. It began not in secrecy, but in splendor. In the heart of the Byzantine Empire stood a beacon of knowledge, the Imperial Library of Constantinople. Within its walls, more than 120,000 manuscripts rested, many copied and preserved from the ancient world. works by Greek philosophers, Roman engineers, Egyptian healers, texts that traced the arc of human thought across centuries. It was a treasury of accumulated wisdom until the year 1204, when the Fourth Crusade reached its gates. To the world, the sack of Constantinople appeared as chaos. Drunken knights looting a city they were meant to protect. But among the smoke and destruction, a quieter mission unfolded. Vatican agents embedded among the Crusaders moved with purpose. They weren't looking for gold or icons. They were looking for words. Declassified Vatican records now suggest that this wasn't random plunder. It was a deliberate extraction. Rome had long watched the Byzantine libraries with interest and anxiety. Their shelves contained writings that conflicted with church doctrine, scientific treatises centuries ahead of European understanding, and biographies that painted radically different portraits of religious figures. Among the most coveted was the complete works of Aristeras of Samos. Long before Copernicus, Aristeras had mathematically demonstrated that Earth orbited the Sun. His writings were dense, elegant, and damning to a worldview that placed Earth, and by extension the Church, at the center of creation. Another manuscript told a different story of Jesus, penned by Roman historian Eustace of Tiberias. In it, Jesus appeared not as a divine savior, but a revolutionary, a teacher, a man shaped by his time, flawed and impassioned. The Vatican recognized the threat, not just to theology, but to its role as gatekeeper of cosmology, healing, and history. Led by Cardinal Giovanni de Montecorvino, agents used intelligence gathered from sympathetic Byzantine scholars. They knew which manuscripts to seize, which to destroy, which to quietly vanish into the vaults beneath Rome. The operation was swift, surgical. When the smoke cleared, the most sensitive scrolls were gone. Vatican officials later claimed the manuscripts had perished in the fires of war. But internal memos told a different story. The texts had been hidden, deliberately and indefinitely. Over the centuries that followed, scholars from across Europe searched for these missing works. During the Renaissance, when Greek classics were in vogue, requests to access the Vatican's deepest archives were quietly denied. The Church presented itself as protector of lost knowledge, even as it concealed the very scrolls that could have rewritten history. Why hide them? The reasons were complex. Some truths threatened theological authority. Others challenged the legitimacy of miracles or holy figures. Still others contained medical knowledge that could undermine the Church's grip on healing and the miraculous. In suppressing these texts, the Church wasn't merely hoarding knowledge, it was sculpting reality. Imagine if Aristeras' heliocentric model had reached Europe in the 13th century. If surgical techniques described in ancient medical papyri had been applied in medieval hospitals. If a nuanced historical account of Jesus had been debated alongside the canonical Gospels. How might science, medicine, and faith have evolved? But history isn't made only by what is discovered. It is shaped, too, by what is silenced. The Vatican heist reminds us that some of humanity's greatest truths were not lost by accident, but hidden with intent, not to destroy, but to delay, until a time deemed more appropriate, or never at all. And so we ask, when institutions decide what the world is ready to know, who speaks for the future? We often picture the Library of Alexandria consumed by flames, an apocalyptic end to the greatest repository of ancient wisdom. But what if the truth was colder, quieter, and more deliberate? Recent archaeological evidence suggests that the library wasn't destroyed in a single blaze. In fact, it may not have burned at all, not in the way we imagine. The real story begins long before its supposed ruin. It begins with a plan. In 391 CE, under orders from Emperor Theodosius I, Roman officials began systematically targeting pagan temples and knowledge centers. Alexandria, with its vast archives of engineering, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, became a primary target. But this wasn't just a cultural purge. It was a calculated extraction. Roman agents, disguised as preservers of knowledge, entered the library not to protect it, but to empty it. They had been briefed. They knew which manuscripts to find, texts containing dangerous blueprints, forgotten technologies, histories of civilizations that predated recorded time. Documents that, if made public, could unravel official narratives and alter the empire's grip on truth. Among the seized scrolls were the engineering treatises of Hero of Alexandria, detailed instructions for building steam-powered machines, automata, and even rudimentary computers. Devices that, had they spread, could have propelled the ancient world into an early industrial age. Instead, they were locked away. Other manuscripts traced the memory of pre-flood civilizations, cultures with astronomical knowledge and descriptions of cataclysms that suggested a cyclic rather than linear human story. Their presence threatened the empire's assertion that Roman civilization represented the peak of progress. These records were removed. The medical scrolls taken from Alexandria were no less revolutionary. They described surgical procedures, plant-based pharmaceuticals, and psychological techniques that modern medicine wouldn't rediscover for centuries. But in a world where power flowed through controlled knowledge, through miracle healings and divine intervention, this science was unwelcome. The Roman operation was meticulous. They employed local scholars as intermediaries, persuading them that they were saving texts from religious zealots. Believing they were rescuing knowledge, these scholars became unwitting accomplices in its disappearance. Manuscripts were packed into crates, labeled for protection, and shipped to secret imperial archives, far from public view. Centuries later, when scholars mourned the burning of Alexandria, Roman officials allowed the myth to flourish. Better a tragic fire than a calculated theft. Better a loss blamed on chaos than a theft blamed on empire. In the 1990s, excavations near the supposed site of the library revealed signs not of fire, but of systematic removal. Storage areas showed no scorch marks. Instead, they bore the quiet scars of careful evacuation. Transport logs from Roman archives, long overlooked, recorded shipments of hundreds of crates bound for unnamed destinations during the exact window of the library's destruction. The loss of Alexandria is not just a story of what was taken, but what might have been. Had those engineering texts circulated, the mechanical age might have begun 1,000 years earlier. Had the astronomical calculations survived, our understanding of the cosmos might have advanced centuries ahead. Had the medical scrolls been taught in schools, millions of lives could have been saved. Instead, the wisdom was buried, not in ash, but in secrecy. And so the question remains, when progress is measured by the knowledge we share, what is the cost of hiding it? The jungle holds its breath. Deep in the Yucatan, beneath thick canopies and stone ruins, a different kind of library once pulsed with life. The Maya, master astronomers and mathematicians, recorded the heavens with a precision that stunned even the stars. But when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they brought with them fire and silence. The official story tells of missionaries burning pagan texts in public squares, condemning them as demonic. But hidden within court archives in Madrid is another version, a quieter one. Not destruction, but selection. Not fire, but theft. As conquistadors moved through the peninsula, they encountered libraries filled with folded codices. Bark paper books inked with celestial maps, prophecies, and scientific records. These were not mere myths. They contained planetary cycles, eclipse predictions accurate to the minute, and calendar systems so complex they incorporated galactic alignments unknown to European science. The Spanish didn't destroy all of it. They couldn't. Some things were too extraordinary to ignore. Agents confiscated the most sophisticated codices and shipped them back to Spain. Not for condemnation, but for study. In a locked chamber of the Royal Observatory, mathematicians pored over Mayan astronomy. Pedro de Medina, the Spanish court's leading navigator, used Mayan star charts to refine maritime routes, correct calendar errors, and anticipate weather patterns, but his sources were never named. The knowledge, stripped of its origin, was rebranded as European innovation. One manuscript, the Jaguar Prophecy, predicted the arrival of pale-skinned invaders, the spread of disease, and the collapse of empires with unnerving precision. Spanish authorities quickly recognized the danger. If these predictions became public, they could undermine colonial rule and elevate the status of indigenous wisdom. The prophecy disappeared. Even more revolutionary was the star calendar, a codex revealing that the Maya had charted the motions of Venus, Mars, and lunar phases with mathematical systems more accurate than anything available in 16th century Europe. It hinted at a worldview not rooted in superstition, but in observation and precision. It challenged the hierarchy of knowledge the Spanish had assumed. The Mayan codices also held secrets in medicine. They described the use of plants to treat diseases for which Europe had no remedy. Formulas for healing infections, easing childbirth, calming the mind. Remedies now echoed in modern pharmaceuticals, but never traced back to their true authors. When Catholic scholars requested access to these codices for translation, they were told the documents had been destroyed. In reality, they had been moved to secure archives. Later, when fragments began to resurface and scholars grew curious, Spanish officials fueled the myth of the burning, ensuring that no one would go looking for what they had taken. Even today, attempts to recover these manuscripts from state collections are denied. The documents are said to be lost or too fragile to handle, but references to them continue to surface in records, whispers of their influence, echoes of their presence. The Mayan manuscript seizure is more than a story of colonial theft. It is a mirror reflecting how easily the world dismisses knowledge that doesn't wear the right cultural costume. How wisdom, when stripped of its origin, can be celebrated by the same systems that once tried to erase it. And we must ask, how many breakthroughs do we celebrate today without knowing who truly made them? And what would change if we did? High in the mountains of Tibet, knowledge was never written for conquest. It was cultivated for transformation. In 1959, as Chinese forces swept into the Himalayan plateau, monasteries became more than religious targets. They were vaults, repositories of consciousness, housing scrolls and manuscripts preserved across generations of disciplined inner exploration. While the invasion was framed as political liberation, evidence now suggests a second motive, concealed beneath military movements: the acquisition of knowledge not just about the world, but about the mind. The Chinese government had identified Tibetan monasteries as holding something rare: techniques for controlling the human body through meditation, for quieting the mind until it could perceive without senses, and for reaching altered states of consciousness that science had barely begun to imagine. These were not myths to them, they were strategies. Agents moved with precision, often with the help of Tibetan translators, coerced or manipulated into cooperation. Texts were selected, copied, or confiscated, while temples burned behind them. Not all knowledge could be replicated. Some of it was embedded in ritual, oral instruction, and lived practice. But the Chinese forces knew what to look for. Among the stolen manuscripts was the so-called Consciousness Transfer Manual, a guide that described how trained monks could separate awareness from the physical body, experiencing out-of-body travel, even maintaining awareness after clinical death. Another scroll detailed how breath, posture, and thought could be combined to control involuntary functions: heart rate, temperature, pain. Western science called it impossible, but Chinese researchers saw potential military applications: espionage, endurance training, psychological warfare. The idea that a person could remain calm under torture, perceive across distances, or detect deception through focused meditation challenged conventional limits. Medical texts told of healing not through herbs or surgery, but through focused intention. Monks accelerating tissue repair, resisting infection, or altering brain chemistry through thought alone. While difficult to replicate in laboratories, these cases intrigued the scientists assigned to study them in secret facilities. The goal wasn't cultural preservation, it was weaponization. Chinese officials later claimed that religious materials were destroyed in the spirit of modernization. But survivors who escaped to India told another story. They described interrogations aimed at locating specific scrolls, monks being executed for refusing to interpret esoteric diagrams, and truckloads of manuscripts disappearing into military compounds. Today, the official stance is silence. Requests to examine what was taken are denied. The line between superstition and science remains blurred, deliberately so. Meanwhile, reports surface of classified consciousness research programs, some echoing practices found in the stolen Tibetan texts. The tragedy is not just in what was taken, but in what was lost. Tibetan knowledge was experiential. Its truths lived in practice, not just parchment. Without the full cultural context, spiritual training, ethical grounding, ritual framing, many techniques become inert. Or worse, misunderstood. This was not simply a theft of books. It was a rupture, a severing of lineage, a forced translation of sacred knowledge into a language of power and control. And so we ask, when wisdom born from compassion is transformed into a tool of domination, does the knowledge remain the same? Or does its meaning change with the hands that hold it? The American plains hold more than open skies. Beneath them lies a history carved not into stone, but memory, oral traditions passed like sacred fire, generation to generation. From the 1870s to the early 20th century, that fire was stolen. Under the guise of anthropology and assimilation, federal agents and missionaries fanned out across Native American lands. They came with notebooks and promises of preservation, but their true goal was extraction. They weren't just taking languages or stories, they were after science, knowledge forged from millennia of living in deep relationship with the land. Declassified documents from the Bureau of Indian Affairs reveal a systematic campaign to confiscate tribal texts, maps, and ceremonial teachings. Some were handwritten, others were oral histories coaxed into written form through coerced interviews. All were taken under the justification of saving a vanishing culture. In truth, much of what they recorded was redirected for profit. Among the most targeted materials were geological maps. Native nations had charted the earth beneath their feet with uncanny accuracy, identifying oil reserves, mineral veins, and freshwater sources based on natural cues and ancestral knowledge. These maps were quietly handed over to private companies. Tribal land was later seized, legally or violently, for resource extraction, justified by data stolen from the very people being displaced. Even more valuable were agricultural manuals describing advanced soil techniques, crop rotation systems, and plant breeding strategies developed long before European contact. Indigenous farmers had learned to grow sustainably in harsh environments. Their knowledge was stripped, sanitized, and rebranded by federal agricultural departments as modern innovation. But perhaps the greatest theft occurred in the realm of medicine. Tribal pharmacopoeias, passed through generations of medicine keepers, documented the healing properties of thousands of plants. They described not just what to use, but when and how. Formulations for treating infection, calming the mind, easing childbirth, and extending life. Pharmaceutical corporations, through government intermediaries, gained access to these texts. Patents followed. Credits did not. Even weather prediction was taken. Tribes had developed systems based on clouds, animals, and wind patterns that could forecast droughts, floods, and seasonal shifts with remarkable accuracy. The National Weather Service later incorporated many of these techniques, stripped of origin. When tribal leaders demanded the return of their knowledge, they were told the documents had been donated to universities for cultural preservation. But internal memos revealed that the most sensitive and valuable texts had been locked away, classified, inaccessible, studied in secret by government researchers. the theft did not stop at data. Spiritual teachings were taken too. Ceremonial instructions, consciousness practices, and sensory awareness techniques meant for healing and initiation were repackaged for psychological experiments and military research. Universities were instructed to focus only on folklore, not science. Funding for research into the technical sophistication of indigenous knowledge dried up. Scholars who tried to challenge the narrative were sidelined. A myth was preserved that native cultures were noble but primitive. But behind that myth is a different story, one of stolen genius, of scientific systems encoded in prayer songs and star maps, of people who had already solved problems modern science still wrestles with, only to have their solutions silenced. And so we ask, what would it mean to acknowledge the true origin of our progress? To admit that the future we now claim was once carried in the hands of those we tried to erase? The Egyptian desert has always whispered secrets through its winds, tales of pharaohs, pyramids, and gods etched into stone. But in the 1920s, a different kind of expedition arrived. Not to uncover ancient relics for museums, but to hunt something far more disruptive: medicine. Behind the funding of several major archaeological digs were the silent partners of the pharmaceutical world, executives who believed the sands of Egypt concealed something dangerous to their business model: not curses, not treasures, but cures. The target was papyri, scrolls written in ink faded by time but alive with knowledge. Among them was the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, containing surgical techniques that rivaled or even exceeded 20th century practices. Detailed diagrams, procedural notes, antiseptic methods, centuries ahead of their time. Another, the Ebers papyrus, described pharmacological formulas using plants, minerals, and dietary therapies that could challenge the very foundation of patent-based medicine. These weren't folk remedies. They were systematic, repeatable, scientific. Archaeologists on the payroll of pharmaceutical interests were instructed to prioritize medical texts. Culturally interesting documents were left behind for museums. The real treasures, cancer treatments using natural compounds, birth control methods safer than modern alternatives, herbal protocols for mental health, were boxed, sealed, and shipped not to libraries, but to private research labs. One particularly guarded manuscript detailed a pregnancy and childbirth manual. It described natural methods for prenatal care, labor induction, and postnatal recovery, with success rates that far outpaced contemporary obstetric practices. To release this information, pharmaceutical companies realized, would be to lose control of one of their most profitable markets. Even more disturbing for them was a set of formulas that described treatments for cardiovascular disease, neurological disorders, and inflammatory conditions using widely available ingredients, many of which were later synthesized, patented, and sold at a premium. But their ancient origins were erased from history. Egyptian authorities, offered bribes and international prestige, looked the other way. Official excavation reports omitted references to medical papyri. When independent scholars requested access to these texts, they were told the documents had been lost, destroyed, or deemed too fragile to handle. Instead, museums received carefully edited fragments, stripped of their most potent content. In private, pharmaceutical companies reverse-engineered what they could, filing patents under modern branding. Drugs based on these ancient cures began appearing in the market, advertised as breakthroughs, marketed as miracles, their true origins buried beneath corporate secrecy and scientific gatekeeping. As medical historians began noticing strange parallels between ancient Egyptian texts and emerging pharmaceutical formulations, research into the matter was quietly discouraged. Grants were denied. Journals rejected articles. A line was drawn between medicine and mythology, one that served to protect profit, not truth. The suppression wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. These papyri challenged the assumption that modern science always moves forward. that what lies behind us is inferior, primitive, obsolete. To admit otherwise would be to admit that our ancestors knew more than we gave them credit for, that perhaps healing was once rooted not in industry, but wisdom. So we must ask, if the cure for today's most devastating illnesses has already been found, written down, buried, and then stolen, how do we reclaim it? And more urgently, who decides whether we get to? In the cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets once bore the fingerprints of minds that thought far ahead of their time. These weren't myths or prayers. They were equations, star charts, engineering diagrams pressed into soft earth and baked beneath the sun. But in the 1930s, as archaeological digs spread across Iraq, something strange began to happen. The most extraordinary tablets disappeared. Officially, these finds were destined for museums and academic institutions. But behind the scenes, government agents and private collectors were selectively removing the most advanced artifacts, texts that spoke of knowledge humanity wasn't supposed to possess yet. The pattern was clear: keep the stories, take the science. Among the missing were tablets inscribed with astonishing mathematical precision. They described geometric theorems and algebraic systems, rivaling what modern mathematicians would develop only centuries later. Some appeared to outline primitive computing principles, ways to process numbers algorithmically, long before electricity made it possible. But what alarmed researchers the most were the astronomical tablets. They mapped planetary movements with such detail that even with today's technology, the accuracy would impress. Stellar positions, retrograde patterns, eclipse cycles, all calculated with methods suggesting the Sumerians had observational tools or techniques lost to time. How had they done it? Also missing were records that described pre-flood civilizations, accounts of societies with technologies and sciences that vanished mysteriously, only to echo later in myths around the world. The suggestion was unsettling, that knowledge rises and falls in cycles, and we may not be the first peak. As these tablets quietly vanished into private hands, museums received only the safe fragments, the hymns, the prayers, the trade records. Anything too advanced was declared damaged, lost in transit, or withheld for national security concerns. Scholars began to notice the gaps. Where were the engineering texts mentioned in earlier dig reports? Why were certain catalog numbers missing entirely? Private aerospace and defense companies later filed patents suspiciously similar to some of the lost tablet descriptions. Advanced alloys, vibration-resistant architecture, the use of celestial mechanics for navigation. And yet, when asked, no connection to ancient sources was ever acknowledged. When universities pressed for access, they were told the tablets had been purchased legally by collectors and were unavailable for public study. Even international efforts to track the missing texts met roadblocks. Thousands of items had simply disappeared, some believed to be stored in underground vaults, others digitized and encrypted beyond reach. The few that have resurfaced hint at a civilization far more advanced than previously believed. Not in mysticism, but in science. And the question becomes unavoidable. If such knowledge existed once, and it did, why were we taught otherwise? The suppression wasn't accidental. It was protective, of a narrative that insists progress is linear, and we are its pinnacle. To acknowledge Sumerian mastery in math, astronomy, or engineering would mean admitting that human brilliance is older and perhaps more cyclical than we're comfortable with. So we are left with an eerie silence, thousands of tablets unread, unseen, lost not to time, but to decision. And we must ask, what kind of future might we be building if the foundations we ignore were stronger than the ones we now stand upon? Europe, 1943. Amid the chaos of World War II, an unusual race was quietly underway, not for territory or weaponry, but for knowledge buried in medieval vaults. Alchemical manuscripts, long dismissed as arcane fantasy, suddenly drew the urgent attention of both Nazi and Allied forces. They were hunting not gold but formulas, forgotten sciences disguised as mysticism. Hidden in monasteries, private collections, and ancient libraries were texts that spoke of transmutation, exotic metals, and energy reactions beyond the scope of modern chemistry. Many believed them to be symbolic, but some scientists knew better. One manuscript, the legendary Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, contained cryptic instructions that, when decoded, described atomic manipulation techniques resembling low-energy nuclear reactions. Allied researchers, especially those involved in early atomic programs, were intrigued. If medieval scholars had stumbled upon even rudimentary ways to harness atomic change, it could open doors far beyond the Manhattan Project. Another set of texts detailed the creation of alloys lighter than aluminum and stronger than steel. Descriptions of chemical processes not found in any modern literature, reactions that produce substances with energy densities comparable to rocket fuel, or materials that exhibited superconductive properties long before their discovery in the 20th century. The Nazis had already begun experimenting with these ideas. Their occult and scientific divisions worked in tandem, decoding alchemical texts, building prototypes, and exploring unconventional energy sources. When the Allies seized these facilities, they took more than equipment. They took the knowledge. After the war, the classified research continued under a new banner. Intelligence agencies quietly confiscated the most valuable alchemical manuscripts. Universities received filtered microfilms, textual fragments stripped of technical diagrams. The rest vanished into government archives, where material science and defense departments continued reverse engineering the insights. Historians who attempted to study alchemy with scientific seriousness were ridiculed. Funding dried up. Academic departments were steered away from any inquiry that might reveal the real potential of these texts. Alchemy remained, publicly, a quaint historical curiosity. Privately, it became a well of inspiration for military technology and advanced materials research. Some of today's breakthroughs, metal foams, energy-dense compounds, memory alloys, bear strange resemblance to descriptions found in those confiscated manuscripts. But no footnotes tie them to the past. The knowledge was rebranded, its lineage severed. The most sensitive material concerned energy generation, chemical systems that appeared to pull ambient energy from reactions not yet understood by modern physics. If true, these methods could undermine fossil fuel economies and disrupt global energy infrastructures. Better to bury them. Patent applications citing similar principles were quietly classified. Researchers with unusual success in alternative energy fields found themselves blacklisted or investigated. The veil over alchemical knowledge was not just about skepticism, it was about control. And so a body of wisdom once dismissed as magical was revealed to be, in part, scientific, coded, obscured, but real. What was once burned at the stake or laughed out of salons now fuels silent laboratories and classified innovation. This theft wasn't just of ancient texts. It was a theft of centuries of experimentation and insight cast aside by history, then reclaimed in secret. So we must ask, if the truths of alchemy were hidden in plain sight, how many other discarded ideas wait to be rediscovered, not by permission, but by persistence? The red soil of Australia carries stories older than written language. For over 50,000 years, Aboriginal communities passed knowledge through ceremony, song, and landscape, encoding science into rhythm and ritual. But between 1950 and 1980, those stories were quietly stolen. Government anthropologists, backed by mining interests and defense departments, launched a coordinated campaign across the continent. Posing as cultural researchers, they visited sacred sites, interviewed elders, and photographed ceremonial objects. What they sought wasn't folklore, it was data. The most valuable of this stolen knowledge were geological maps. passed through Dreamtime narratives, these songlines contained accurate information about underground water sources, mineral seams, and ecological patterns, mapped not with paper and ink, but memory and movement. Mining companies recognize the potential, reduce exploration costs, increase precision, and extract resources under the guise of discovery. Another category of interest: weather prediction. Aboriginal traditions had developed systems for forecasting droughts, floods, and seasonal shifts through observations of animal behavior, plant cycles, and atmospheric changes. These methods were far more localized and accurate than the Western models of the time. The Bureau of Meteorology adopted many of these techniques, stripped them of cultural context, and erased their origin. Even more astonishing were the navigation methods. Aboriginal peoples traveled vast distances across the desert without compasses or maps, guided only by the stars, wind, and subtle landmarks. Their spatial memory systems rivaled satellite guidance, and organic GPS developed long before the digital age. Military agencies quietly classified this information, seeing strategic value in low-tech, high-reliability navigation. But perhaps the deepest loss came in the realm of medicine. Traditional healers held encyclopedic knowledge of plants and minerals, remedies for infections, pain, fertility, and psychological conditions. Healing ceremonies integrated mind and body in ways that modern integrative medicine now begins to explore. Pharmaceutical companies, through government liaisons, accessed these formulations, filed patents, and monetized treatments without acknowledgement. When Aboriginal leaders requested the return of their sacred knowledge, they were told it had been donated or misplaced. Internal documents told a different story. The most valuable information had been transferred to research facilities or private contractors, where it was studied for military and commercial use. University programs funded by these same interests were instructed to frame Aboriginal knowledge as cultural heritage, not science. Any researcher attempting to highlight its technical sophistication faced institutional pushback. Once again, a narrative was preserved that indigenous knowledge was spiritual, not empirical. And yet, decades later, aerospace engineers reference Aboriginal observations of meteors and comets. Climate researchers consult ancient fire management practices. Botanists rediscover healing compounds known to tribal elders long ago. Slowly, pieces reemerge, but the systems that took them still refuse to name their source. This wasn't a war of weapons, it was a war of words, of erasure, of appropriation disguised as preservation. And it reveals something uncomfortable, that modern science is not always built on progress, but sometimes on plunder. So we must ask, how much further ahead might we be if we had listened instead of taken? What wisdom still lies in the land, not waiting to be discovered, but remembered? Amid the ruins of war-torn Europe, one more treasure hunt unfolded, less visible than gold, more valuable than relics. As Nazi forces occupied Greece during World War II, their agents weren't just after control. They were after manuscripts, ancient ones, locked away in monasteries and private libraries, whispering secrets of science and mathematics lost to time. Greece, cradle of Western thought, held more than philosophy. Its forgotten texts housed engineering blueprints, optical theories, and chemical knowledge centuries ahead of modern understanding. The Nazis knew what they were looking for. Among the most prized was the Archimedes palimpsest, a medieval parchment overwritten with prayers, beneath which lay Archimedes' original work on calculus, mechanical levers, and infinite series. These weren't abstractions. They were technical plans, blueprints for automata, water pumps, and advanced war machines that had once protected ancient cities. Nazi scientists, obsessed with weaponizing forgotten knowledge, viewed these as schematics for a technological leap. They succeeded in acquiring many such documents, but when the war turned, Allied forces captured the Nazi archives, and with them the stolen Greek manuscripts. One might expect these treasures to be returned to Greece, but they weren't. Instead, they were quietly distributed among American and British intelligence agencies. The reasons were strategic. The manuscripts included not only theoretical mathematics, but also descriptions of sound engineering techniques used in ancient amphitheaters. Geometry so precise it allowed whispers on stage to be heard clearly in the back rows. Military researchers saw potential in these acoustic designs for surveillance, communication, and battlefield tactics. Other texts described chemical mixtures, some akin to the lost formula of Greek fire, others suggesting metallurgical processes that produced lightweight, heat-resistant alloys. These were no longer museum pieces. They became blueprints. Post-war universities were given selective access. Cultural content was shared. Scientific content was classified. Scholars received translations that omitted the mathematical depths. Funding flowed to projects that treated Greek science as symbolic, not applicable. Meanwhile, research facilities quietly incorporated the knowledge into Cold War projects. The origins of these breakthroughs were attributed to post-war innovation. The legacy of Greek ingenuity was scrubbed from the record. Greek officials, upon requesting the return of their cultural property, were told the documents were destroyed, misplaced, or privately held. Yet references to their contents appeared in declassified defense research and aerospace designs, the fingerprints of ancient minds repurposed without recognition. This wasn't merely theft, it was a rewriting of the intellectual timeline, one that preserved the myth that modern science is a clean upward arc, unbroken, unassisted. A myth that required suppressing the inconvenient truth that the ancients may have already reached heights we've only just begun to climb again. The Greek manuscript heist reminds us that knowledge doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it circles back. Sometimes it's buried, only to be unearthed and claimed anew by those in power. So we must ask, how many of today's advances are echoes of ancient brilliance, stolen and renamed? And what does it say about us, that we still measure progress by how well we forget who thought of it first? The pattern was complete, the circle closed. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Tibet, from Mayan temples to Greek monasteries, a quiet campaign had unfolded over centuries. The extraction and suppression of knowledge, not by one villain, but by many, not for destruction, but control. Now, in the 21st century, we live in the afterglow of this theft. Scientific advances appear sudden, disconnected from history, emerging from labs without lineage. But when we trace the shadows behind them, we see familiar silhouettes: indigenous healers, ancient engineers, forgotten astronomers whose wisdom was taken, rebranded, and resold to a world that had been taught to ignore its origins. The evidence is scattered but persistent. Modern farming owes its efficiency to crop rotation methods first documented in Native American manuals, once labeled primitive and now taught in agricultural universities. Pharmaceutical companies build billion-dollar industries on plant compounds known for generations in Aboriginal and Amazonian traditions. Formulas once dismissed as superstition, now protected by patents. Navigation systems and celestial models mimic techniques found in Sumerian tablets, Mayan codices, and Polynesian star maps, tools of orientation long before satellites, but now stripped of their ancestry. And behind it all, a quiet denial persists. Universities frame ancient knowledge as symbolic, not empirical. Museums display cultural artifacts, but not the sciences they once served. Libraries hold fragments, but withhold meaning. And institutions, religious, academic, governmental, continue to curate a version of history that celebrates linear progress, while concealing the detours they themselves created. This final chapter of our journey isn't about blame, it's about reckoning. The story of stolen knowledge is not merely a tale of loss. It is a mirror reflecting who we are and who we might have been. The texts taken weren't just manuscripts, they were possibilities. Futures that arrived early and were silenced. questions answered too soon, then buried to protect the fragile hierarchies of their time. Imagine if those ideas had been allowed to grow. If the heliocentric model had taken root in the 3rd century BCE, what would space travel look like today? If ancient medical systems had merged with early modern science, how many lives might have been saved? If consciousness research from Tibetan or Native American traditions had shaped psychology, what might we know now about the mind? But history, like memory, is not only what we preserve, it is also what we forget. As we conclude, we must ask not only what was taken, but what remains. In oral traditions still alive, in ceremonies still practiced, in fragments tucked into family stories and sacred places. The knowledge was never entirely erased. It waits, not to be exploited, but understood, not to be patented, but respected. The final question, then, is ours to answer. Will we continue to build a future on forgotten foundations, denying the truths beneath our feet? Or will we begin to listen, finally, to the voices we once silenced? Because the past is not past, it is dormant, and knowledge, even stolen, finds its way home. The silence after the storm is where truth often hides. Across the centuries, each act of suppression, whether cloaked in religious righteousness, national security, or academic gatekeeping, has left not just a void, but an echo. That echo is felt every time a discovery is treated as novel when it is, in fact, remembered. Every time a voice is praised for innovation, while another, older one, was silenced for speaking the same. The stolen secrets weren't only words on parchment. They were systems of thought. They were philosophies of health, of cosmos, of mind and spirit that challenged narrow definitions of reality. They asked dangerous questions. What if healing isn't a product, but a process anyone can learn? What if we're not at the center of the universe, or even the first to map its rhythms? What if consciousness itself can stretch beyond the body, and truth lies not only in what we see, but what we feel? These were not just theories. They were lived understandings, documented with precision, verified through generations of trial, and hidden because they dared to suggest that power did not reside in crowns, cathedrals, or corporations, but in people, in communities. In cultures the world had worked hard to forget. The thefts were strategic, not random. Institutions knew what they were taking and why. A text that challenged doctrine, a formula that threatened a patent, a prophecy that unsettled colonial rule. The pattern was unmistakable. Identify the knowledge, confiscate the source, deny its origin, then profit. Even today, efforts to unearth these truths are met with resistance. Government archives remain sealed. Religious libraries deny access. Private collectors hoard what should belong to all. And when scholars or indigenous voices speak out, they're told it's myth, coincidence, conspiracy. But slowly, the silence is cracking. Fragments surface, translations escape. Elders speak and are finally heard. And a new generation, one that questions the official story, begins to see the stolen knowledge not as relics of the past, but as keys to a different kind of future. One that does not depend on discarding the old to build the new, but on remembering. And so we arrive at the threshold, not of proof, but of possibility. What if all that was taken, mathematical brilliance, medicinal mastery, philosophical depth, was never truly lost, but waiting? Not for permission, but for recognition, for humility, for listening. Because the real theft was not just of books or scrolls or codices. It was of time, of opportunity, of the chance to evolve sooner, wiser, together. And now, perhaps, it is time to restore what we can, not by raiding vaults, but by reweaving the story. By acknowledging that human greatness has always been wider, older, and more diverse than we were taught to believe. Let us ask, one last time, if knowledge is humanity's birthright, who has the right to keep it hidden? And who will dare at last to remember? We return, not to where we began, but to what was always beneath the surface. This has been a story of forgotten truths, of ancient voices nearly erased but never fully silenced. A journey through vaults and monasteries, across deserts and mountains, through myths that were never myths at all. Each part revealed not just what was lost, but what was taken, and why. The answer, again and again, was control. Knowledge threatens when it arrives too early. It challenges when it comes from the wrong place, from those deemed unworthy, uncredentialed, too ancient, too indigenous, too mystical. So it is locked away, dismissed, stripped of origin, and worn by those with power. But what if we've misunderstood the arc of progress? What if history doesn't march forward like a drumbeat, but pulses in waves, knowledge rising, crashing, retreating, returning? What if those ancient discoveries weren't anomalies, but memories? What if humanity has always been capable of more, technologically, philosophically, spiritually, than our current systems allow? In this light, the thefts we've explored are more than academic tragedies. They are fractures in the timeline, detours that cost us generations of growth, cures delayed, questions postponed, connections severed between people and planet, mind and body, self and community. And yet, hope remains, not in recovering every lost manuscript, but in how we choose to see knowledge itself, as something not owned, but shared, not hidden, but honored, not bound by patents or flags or institutions, but flowing across cultures and time. The future, then, is not built only with new ideas, but with old ones remembered, with listening to elders, with reinterpreting myths as maps, with respecting that some truths cannot be tested in labs, only lived. As we close this story, we are left with no final revelation, no singular artifact to hold, only a question that echoes across centuries. What world might we build if we treated knowledge not as property, but as a gift? If we looked not forward, but inward, not up, but back? Not to conquer truth, but to carry it, together. The libraries may be gone, the texts may be hidden, but the wisdom, they never truly stole it all. It lives still, in the earth, in the sky, in the stories we are finally ready to tell.